In the summer of 1929, American factories expanded at record levels. Skyscrapers reached into the clouds, physical proof of the nation's growing wealth. People looked at these expanding cities and believed they were standing inside an infinite economic boom. Automobiles and radios moved from luxury items to staples of the American household. These devices brought families together in their living rooms, connecting them to a unified sense of national optimism. The center of that optimism was Wall Street. Previously a closed financial circuit for elite bankers, the stock market became a national obsession. Teachers, shopkeepers, and farmers rushed to buy shares. They tracked commodity prices and daily valuations, convinced the numbers would climb indefinitely. The stock market became a core pillar of American identity, anchored by the widespread belief that this era of prosperity would never end. To enter that rising market, ordinary citizens utilized a specific financial strategy, buying on margin. An investor uses a small amount of cash to secure a much larger block of stock, with a bank loan covering the difference. As prices rose, this leveraged strategy worked, generating enormous returns relative to the initial deposit. Stories of regular people getting rich spread rapidly. In response, banks eagerly opened their vaults, financing millions of speculative trades and encouraging businesses to expand aggressively. But the nation's perceived wealth rested entirely on assumed growth. The market's immense size was an illusion, supported by a vast foundation of bank debt. While Wall Street celebrated, serious weaknesses were forming inside the real economy. A small percentage of Americans controlled a massive share of the nation's wealth. The economic gains of the decade were almost entirely captured by an elite class, enjoying lavish excesses. Meanwhile, the industrial workers keeping the factories running saw little of that wealth. Despite record production, wages were stagnant, and many lived paycheck to paycheck. Outside the cities, the situation was severe. Rural farmers were suffocating under a steep drop in agricultural prices, struggling to survive long before the market crashed. The booming stock market masked a fractured consumer base. The people building the country lacked the spending power needed to keep the system alive. That lack of spending power led directly to overproduction. Factories churned out millions of goods, far exceeding what the struggling public could afford to buy. This chart visualizes the disconnect. Corporate revenue flattened as inventory piled up, while speculative trading pushed stock prices higher. The widening gap between flat revenue and soaring prices represents a massive economic bubble. Wall Street detached from mathematical reality. Financial experts and economists saw this divergence. They loudly warned that the soaring prices were unsustainable and a collapse was imminent. The public ignored them. Consumers and amateur investors, driven by the promise of easy money, refused to acknowledge the warnings staring them in the face. By the autumn of 1929, the fragile financial structure could no longer support its own weight. A brief drop in stock prices panicked nervous investors. They began selling off their shares to protect their accounts. Then the margin loans came due. Banks demanded immediate repayment, forcing investors to dump even more stock to cover their debts. The downward slide accelerated. On October 24th, Black Thursday, that slide turned into a blind panic. Millions of shares were unloaded onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The trading volume was so immense that the mechanical ticker tape machines jammed. Investors across the country were left waiting for hours, blind to how rapidly their fortunes were vanishing. News of the chaos spilled into the streets. Thousands of desperate citizens swarmed Wall Street, trying to find out what was happening to their money. Crowded around the entrance of the exchange, they stared at the closed doors. The illusion of permanent wealth had evaporated. The collapse on Wall Street signaled the arrival of a systemic failure. This event initiated a chain reaction that would wipe out banks, erase millions of livelihoods, and plunge the nation into the deepest economic crisis in its history. American cities were expanding rapidly. Automobiles filled the streets, new technologies entered homes, and millions of people operated under a single unifying assumption: this era of prosperity would continue indefinitely. The engine behind this confidence was industrial manufacturing. Factories were turning out consumer goods at record volumes, utilizing new assembly lines to mass-produce everything from radios to cars faster than ever before. That visible industrial growth turned the stock market into a national obsession. Ordinary workers, teachers, and shopkeepers rushed to buy shares right alongside wealthy elites, eager to capture a piece of the booming economy. But the high production volumes were outpacing what consumers could actually afford to buy. While a small fraction of the country controlled a large share of the wealth, a vast majority of workers were living paycheck to paycheck, unable to absorb the constant flood of new guts. The visible wealth of the decade was largely a facade. The underlying consumer base was incredibly fragile, leaving the entire economic system highly vulnerable to even the slightest disruption. To keep participating in the market despite having limited cash, ordinary investors turned to a practice known as buying on margin. This meant they were borrowing money to purchase their stocks. Buying on margin let investors control large share blocks using a tiny cash fraction, covering the remainder with loans. While share prices climbed, rising values flawlessly paid off the debt. But if values dropped below purchase price, investors held shares worth less than their loans. American banks aggressively encouraged this exact type of borrowing. They took the deposits of everyday savers and lent that money directly to speculators trading on Wall Street. By lending deposit comms to margin traders, banks tightly tethered the security of ordinary household savings to the volatile, high-risk gambles of the stock market. In the autumn of 1929, the mood on Wall Street shifted. Investors noticed the accumulating weaknesses in the economy and began quietly selling their positions, replacing confidence with caution. That caution turned to panic on October 24, known as Black Thursday. Investors desperately dumped millions of shares onto the market, drawing anxious crowds into the streets as prices began sliding downward. The sell-off peaked a few days later on October 29. On Black Tuesday, more than 16 million shares were traded, as the remaining investors scrambled to escape. Stock prices crashed past any recognizable value. By the time the closing bell rang, millions of dollars had been wiped out. Fortunes accumulated over a decade vanished in hours. This collapse reached far beyond the trading floor. Because the financial system was deeply interconnected through margin lending, the destruction of those stock values triggered a chain reaction that would strike the entire country. The banks that had eagerly supplied cash to Wall Street investors suddenly realized those margin loans could not be repaid. Without those funds coming back in, the banks themselves became deeply unstable. When news of the market crash spread, fearful customers hurried to their local bank branches. Crowds pressed against the doors, demanding to withdraw their deposits before the money was completely gone. But the banks did not actually hold enough physical cash in their vaults to cover all of their depositors at once. Unable to meet the sudden demand, thousands of institutions were forced to lock their doors permanently. The money was gone. Millions of families who never bought stock watched their entire life savings disappear alongside the failing banks. With the banking system paralyzed, credit froze. Businesses could no longer secure the loans needed to meet payroll or buy materials. Factories drastically reduced production, local shops shuttered, and companies laid off their workers. The failure of the banks acted as a transmission line. It turned a steep financial loss for Wall Street speculators into a severe, widespread economic depression that halted the daily lives of everyday citizens. While the cities struggled with mass unemployment and failing banks, the agricultural heartland was facing its own distinct crisis. Rural farmers had already been struggling with falling crop prices for years before the market even crashed. Those low prices pushed farmers to overwork their land. Years of intensive plowing stripped the topsoil, just as severe drought hit the Great Plains. Without vegetation to hold the soil in place, powerful high winds began to pick up the dry earth. Massive, towering clouds of dust swept across states like Oklahoma and Texas, blocking out the sun and smothering whatever crops remained. The landscape became uninhabitable. Thousands of farming families had no choice but to abandon their properties entirely, packing their few remaining belongings and migrating west in a desperate search for agricultural work. The combination of an economic collapse in the cities and an environmental disaster in the countryside closed off every avenue of escape. Working-class families had nowhere left to turn. By the early 1930s, basic survival became a daily struggle. Once stable workers stood in blocks-long breadlines, relying entirely on charity to feed their families. Evicted from their homes, many gathered in makeshift communities. Sprawling settlements constructed from scrap wood and cardboard began filling empty lots, mockingly named Hoovervilles. This chart visualizes the scale of the damage. By 1933, nearly 1 out of every 4 workers in the American labor force was completely unemployed. As the nation reached rock bottom, a new leader was preparing to take office. Franklin D. Roosevelt was stepping into the presidency with a mandate to take aggressive, direct action to repair the damaged country. The absolute failure of the heavily leveraged 1920s economy cleared the path for a massive expansion of government intervention. The policies that followed would permanently rewrite the rules of American finance. By the summer of 1929, the American economy appeared to be expanding at a staggering pace. Cities pushed aggressively upward, mass-produced automobiles filled the streets, and skyscrapers stood as steel monuments to the nation's rising wealth. Wall Street became the center of a national obsession. The belief that stock prices would climb indefinitely drew in ordinary citizens, teachers, shopkeepers, and farmers, all eager to capture a piece of this seemingly boundless prosperity. Many investors bought on margin, borrowing heavily to purchase shares. This allowed them to control enormous blocks of stock with only a fraction of cash. As the market climbed, this extreme leverage masked underlying risks, convincing the public they'd found a perpetual wealth engine. Yet deep within the real economy, severe fractures were spreading. Farmers were buckling under the weight of falling crop prices, and factories were churning out far more goods than the public could actually afford to buy. At the same time, the distribution of this new wealth was starkly lopsided. A fraction of the population controlled the vast majority of the capital, leaving millions of workers living paycheck to paycheck, highly vulnerable to any economic shock. The booming economy of the 1920s rested on a hyper-fragile, debt-fueled foundation. It was an illusion of invincibility, sensitive to even the slightest disruption. That disruption arrived in the autumn of 1929. Economists had been sounding the alarm about inflated asset values, and slowly, a quiet fear began spreading across the trading floors. Investors rushed to offload shares before prices dropped further. On Black Thursday and Tuesday, panic selling triggered a downward spiral, wiping out fortunes in hours. Shock and chaos rippled through the nation as the public realized their life savings and the perceived economic miracle had vanished instantly. While the crash originated on Wall Street, the system was so heavily leveraged and interconnected that this single spark was destined to detonate the broader economy. The damage quickly bled out of the financial sector. Banks across the country had tied their own stability to the stock market, taking enormous risks by investing customer deposits. Realizing this, fearful account holders rushed to withdraw their funds simultaneously. These bank runs overwhelmed institutions that simply did not hold enough physical cash to meet the sudden demand. Thousands of Americans found themselves standing on sidewalks outside locked buildings. As banks permanently closed their doors, millions realized their entire life savings were gone. The collapse of the banking system severed the flow of credit. Without access to loans, businesses could no longer afford to operate, forcing them into aggressive production cuts and abandoned construction projects. The ripple effect resulted in job losses at an agonizing speed. By 1933, the unemployment rate had soared, leaving nearly 1 out of every 4 American workers without a job. People who had once held stable employment were forced to sell their belongings for food. Breadlines and charity kitchens became the only means of daily survival for thousands of starving families. Mass evictions swept the nation. Having lost our homes, destitute citizens built makeshift shantytowns out of scrap wood and metal. Bleak settlements the public named Hoovervilles. This progression laid bare a stark mechanical truth. An unregulated financial collapse does not contain itself. It cascades downward, systematically depriving the working class of their livelihoods. While the cities buckled under economic paralysis, rural America was hit by a secondary catastrophe, compounding the national misery. Decades of over-farming had stripped the Great Plains of its natural deep-rooted grasses. When a severe, multi-year drought struck the region, the soil turned to loose powder. Massive, suffocating clouds of topsoil swept across the landscape, physically blocking out the sun. These storms decimated millions of acres of farmland, turning the heartland into the Dust Bowl. Stripped of their crops and buried in debt, tens of thousands of farming families abandoned their land. They packed whatever they could carry and began migrating westward as refugees in their own country. By 1933, the United States was entirely paralyzed. The nation found itself caught between a broken market and a broken earth, entering its darkest, most hopeless hour. In March of that year, a new administration took office. Recognizing the scale of the collapse required bold, immediate government action to save the republic. Franklin Delano Roosevelt used his first inaugural address to conquer the paralyzing fear gripping the population, aiming to restore a baseline level of national confidence. He quickly initiated a sweeping series of reforms known as the New Deal. The strategy positioned the federal government as the ultimate economic circuit breaker, forcefully stepping in as the employer of last resort. Broad federal programs began hiring on an unprecedented scale. The Civilian Conservation Corps deployed hundreds of thousands of young men to plant trees, clear forests, and reclaim the damaged environment. Simultaneously, the Works Progress Administration built highways, airports, and dams. These projects constructed the modern physical backbone of the country while injecting life-saving wages into starving families. The administration also forced aggressive interventions on the financial sector. Banks were temporarily closed and subjected to strict federal inspections to ensure they were stable before they were allowed to reopen. While the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression overnight, it successfully stopped the economic freefall and permanently transformed the government into an active shield for its citizens. Full economic recovery finally arrived when the outbreak of World War II forced an explosive industrial mobilization, scaling production to unprecedented levels. But the crisis left permanent scars. It birthed the modern regulatory state and established a social safety net, redefining the basic responsibilities a nation owes its people. The collapse left a stark historical lesson. Unchecked financial speculation and vast wealth inequality act as existential threats to national stability. The firewalls constructed in the 1930s were designed to last forever. Yet over the decades, fading memories and modern deregulation have allowed new, highly complex financial bubbles to inflate. The question is no longer whether another crisis will spark, but whether our current, deeply interwoven global systems can survive the shock when a single failure begins to shatter the entire network.